Okay. I know many of you, and I have a feeling that some of the things I'm going to say tonight will be things that you've heard ad nauseum before, but I hope that, that there'll be a few new wrinkles, a few things that you didn't know about Women's Club and about the library. When Cheryl asked me to tell the story of the Estes Park Women's Club and its founding of the library, I got to thinking that the story is best understood not as a history of an organization or institution, but of the people, the energetic, dedicated, and visionary women who founded both of these organizations. And I say energetic because many of these women had many, many roles. I'm going to turn my PowerPoint on here now. See if we can make it work. Share. There we go. Okay. They're energetic because many of them were wives and mothers who were raising children, or families under very trying circumstances. Some of them, this is a turn of the century, folks. They were using kerosene and wood for light and heat, and some of them may or may not have had running water. And there were also business people and professional people who were in business here, who had full-time jobs and more so, and yet they found time to share themselves and their expertise in the building of this community and these organizations. They were dedicated, and I use that word advisedly because they not only launched the club and the library, but they shepherded these organizations through the first critical decades of their existence. And remember too that at the outset, let me get this going here. Not sure why my PowerPoint's not, there it is. The town was not a town, but it was the intersection of two dirt roads. And during the first part of the 20th century, this little town grew exponentially and very quickly, and largely because of the good work of the women of Women's Club. Now, in a program of 40 minutes, I can hardly name all of them and tell all their stories. But here is a photograph of a group of them, 28 of them. It was taken at Hayden's Ranch in 1913. And it does include 23, I believe, of the charter members. So Women's Club was founded in 1912. This is a year later, and here they are. They are the founding mothers of the Women's Club. They are the founding mothers of the public library. Notice too that there's a range of ages represented here. The youngest was Anna Louise Reed Hayden. She is seated third from left. She was a 26-year-old school teacher. And the oldest is a 68-year-old Imogene Green McPherson, who was the builder and innkeeper of the Moraine Park Lodge. She is standing fifth from left. And Mrs. McPherson was also the very first president of the Estes Park Women's Club. What I want to do tonight is to focus on two of these individuals. Alma Bond, who is standing at the on the top row, third from the left. She has on a white blouse and a dark skirt. And Eleanor Hondius, who's not in the photo, I'm sure she was there that day. I have a feeling she was orchestrating who was to stand next to who was to sit next to whom, and was probably directing the photographer at the same time. There are three other women that I want to point to that eventually served on the library planning committee, and they are Mrs. McMahon. She is standing on the top row, fourth from the right, and where I have all of your pictures open is it blotting off some of that picture. So but she has her hand on her hip. She is, oh dear. I'm sorry about that. Louise Hayden, as already noted, was seated third from left. Dorothy Schwartz is seated fifth from left. And she's holding a piece of paper. Perhaps it is the bylaws that the club had just recently adopted. But both Alma and Eleanor were present from the beginning. And they played such important roles that I think it's appropriate to focus on the two of them. They together drew up the club's articles of incorporation and the bylaws. They were involved in the building of the library, start to finish and even beyond. Alma was the first librarian, and a position that she held for 25 years. And Eleanor was the chief booster and benefactor for the Estes Park Library. We know a good deal about Eleanor's life because she was kind enough to leave us her memoirs. And so we know a little bit about her personal life and her personality. The book was written in 1964 and published soon thereafter, and as was mentioned earlier, was republished by the Friends Press several years ago. Finding information on Alma has been much more challenging. Eleanor's family, the James family, arrived in Estes in the 1870s. Her father, William James, was from New York. He had been a grocer there, upstate New York, before he moved his family, which was Ella and three little boys, to Estes Park in 1874. He had come several years prior on a fishing trip, fell in love with the place, and therefore wanted to make it his home. It's an old story which keeps getting repeated over and over. Although he was initially engaged in ranching, he soon turned to innkeeping, largely because his property lay right at the edge of a vast wilderness, a wonderful, beautiful mountain area, which was destined to become Rocky Mountain National Park. And without any resources in town, many weary and hungry adventurers would stop off at his home, at his ranch house at the end of Elkhorn Avenue, and ask for a meal or ask to stay over or whatever. First, there were tents that were set up in the yard, and then these gave way to tent cabins, which were, if you probably all know this, but they are a platform with wooden walls and a canvas top. And these were then eventually replaced by permanent structures. The ranch house became Elkhorn Lodge. And here it is in 1880. And by the time Eleanor was born, she was born in 1880, the Elkhorn was really a thriving business. Eleanor was born in Loveland at the family's winter home, and she literally grew up at the lodge. By all accounts, and her own included, she was a prank-playing, pony-riding tomboy, which wasn't surprising for a little girl who had three older brothers. She went to local schools. Obviously, the first one was built at the Elkhorn Ranch by her father, who also hired the teacher. But when public school opened downtown, she transferred there and then went on through to high school. She was smart and talented and motivated, a great reader. She learned to play the piano on a piano that her father had hauled up here in a wagon from Denver. And by high school age, she was proficient enough to play for the organ at the services at the community church, which was located on Elkhorn Avenue. And the services were led by Reverend Elkanah Lamb. From an early age, she showed enormous social skills, no doubt honed at the Elkhorn, where there were the visitors included Eastern sophisticates as well as Midwesterners. And from her memoirs, we know that she was an astute and a somewhat acerbic observer of human behavior with a keen, if sometimes wicked, sense of humor. It's really a delight to read. And if you haven't read her memoirs, do it. She also developed a considerable business acumen, which was put to the test during the Depression, where she, at that point, was the sole proprietress of the Elkhorn enterprise, and she managed to keep that enterprise afloat at a time when many resorts were going under. She was only 14 when her father died in 1894, and so after that, she helped run the Elkhorn with her mother and brothers. The family business prospered. As you can see, by the turn of the century, the original house had been expanded, extra rooms, and then in 1901, a new building, a completely new building. The center portion of it was built, and then the wings were added in 1908 and 1914. Eleanor Hondius met Peter Hondius, Eleanor James, she was then, met Peter Hondius at the Elkhorn, where he was a visitor in the 1890s. He had come, he was an immigrant from the Netherlands, and he had come to Estes Park for his health, as did many people during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And eventually bought property in Moraine Park and took up ranching. They were married in 1904. She was 24 and he was 40. So he had come as a much younger man and waited around quite a while till Eleanor would have him, I think. And although he had built a home out at the ranch, the couple lived at the lodge, and he became very quickly interested and active in civic affairs of the town. He joined very soon joined the Estes Park Protective and Improvement Association, the EPPIA, and that organization had been founded in 1896 by Abner Sprigg. In those days, before the town was incorporated, there was no formal governmental structure. And so policymaking ended up in the hands of this all-male group, the EPPIA, and their meetings were served as kind of forum, as in the old New England town meetings, where people would come and debate or discuss local issues. This group of gentlemen were very good at rulemaking and project planning, but raising money was not something that they were very good at all. And so they created a fundraising arm, the Ladies Auxiliary of the Estes Park Protective and Improvement Association. And it was, of course, mostly made up of their wives. Eleanor served as the first president, no surprise there. And Alma Bond was also a member. She was the wife of Cornelius Bond, who was also a prominent member of the EPPIA. Like William James and Peter Hondius, C.H. Bond, as he was called, was a major player in the development of early Estes Park. He had moved to Colorado in the early 1880s from a rural area in southeastern Ohio. He chose to move after he had visited the Estes Valley on a camping trip earlier on. Before coming to Colorado, he had been a teacher, and he was a graduate of Muskingum College. But as soon after his arrival in Loveland, he opened up a grocery store and turned his attention to politics. A lack of prior experience in law enforcement did not prevent him from running for Larimer County Sheriff, which he did in 1895 and served for 5 years. And later on, he was elected twice to the state legislature. So he really was a political animal. In 1889, he married into a very prominent family in Loveland, the Sullivan family. Tragically, his bride, Rebecca Safrona Sullivan, died of pneumonia in 1895, leaving Cornelius a widower and single parent of a 3-year-old little girl named Doris. The following year, he married Alma Sanborn. She was a 33-year-old woman and from his home county in Ohio. The two were married in Denver, however. It's not clear how Cornelius and Alma, at least initially, knew one another, or where they met up all these many years later in Colorado. However, the two of them were raised on farms that were scarcely 10 miles apart in this rural county in Ohio. And so it's quite likely that they had been friends before of long standing. Except for a short article in a local paper stating that Alma had visited her relatives in Ohio just before her wedding to Cornelius, which took place in May of 1896, I've been unable to find any information about her activities that would have forecast this interest in books and libraries that became such a central part of her later life. However, we do know that she graduated from high school, 4 years of high school, and we have to conclude that her family were great supporters of education because 4 of their 7 children in that family had advanced degrees. 2 of them were lawyers, 1 of them was a doctor, and the 4th one was a teacher. By the time Alma and Cornelius were married, Bond was heavily involved in Larimer County real estate. And he was instrumental in planning and then helping to build the road, which is now Highway 34, up the Big Thompson Canyon. Realizing that if he built the road close to the water level, there would be less reason to have to move earth and blast and that kind of thing. Perhaps inevitably, he moved his family to Estes Park, having bought out John Cleves, who was an early resident and owned 160 acres right in what is now downtown Estes Park between the Fall and Big Thompson Rivers. The family moved in 1905 from Loveland into John Cleves' cabin. And he immediately took up a position as the town postmaster. I never heard that he was a painter, or we might call him a Renaissance man. He seems to have done lots and lots of different kinds of things and done them quite well. He joined a company with 2 other men to help lay out the town of Estes Park, which they did, and then to sell lots along Elkhorn and Moraine Avenues, which cost $50 a piece in those days. Not surprisingly, as I mentioned, he joined the EPPIA, and with F.O. Stanley and Peter Hondius, he helped to establish the town's water and electric companies. So where was Alma while she was doing all this? Well, by the time the family moved, she was now the mother of 5. There was Doris, C.H.'s daughter by Safrona Sullivan. She was 13. Then there were the twins, Frank on the left and Florence on the right, who were 7 by the time they came. I included the picture because I thought they were such an interesting little pair, and they also had very interesting lives later on. Frank ended up being the mayor for 7 terms of or 7 years in Estes Park, and Florence, as we'll see, was a librarian for a bit. But they were 7, and then there were 2 other children. There was a 6-year-old Fred and 3-year-old May, and so living in the John Cleve cabin, I can imagine that Alma had her hands full. However, before long, she joined the Ladies Auxiliary of the EPPIA, and along with the other women of that organization, Eleanor Hondius included, busily began to organize and run bazaars, card parties, amateur theatricals, weekly dances, and fairs, some of them very elaborate, all to raise money for the EPPIA. She was also involved with the Ladies Aid Society, the PEO, the local literary and music club, which was very active here. And Eleanor Hondius, as a matter of fact, was a member of all of these same organizations. The summer of 1912 was especially busy and profitable for the Ladies Auxiliary, and they ended up raising $400. As the auxiliary's treasurer, it fell to Eleanor to take the proceeds to a session of the EPPIA. And many of you will then know the story. Coincidentally, if not providentially, Peter Hondius was the treasurer of that organization. And so when Eleanor got to the meeting, she explained to the gentlemen there assembled that their group, the auxiliary, had some ideas about how they would like to see that money spent. And so she presented that idea, which was the building of an improvement of trails in and out of the village. The EPPIA governing boards reminded Eleanor that her group was supposed to raise money and not to make policy. And as one might guess, this interaction did not end up well for the EPPIA. As it's reported, Eleanor snapped her purse shut, having been so ungraciously approached, and turned on her heel and departed and took the cash with her. Her next move was to round up all the ladies of the auxiliary for a meeting, which was held very soon thereafter at the Hupp Hotel. At this meeting, she told the ladies what had happened, and she suggested they create their own organization, thank you very much, using the money that they had earned during the summer. So the result was that in the fall of 1912, the Ladies Improvement and Development Society was created, and they almost immediately changed their name to the Estes Park Women's Club. It's kind of fun to imagine the tenor of dinner table conversations that went on in the Hondius and Bond homes during the days, weeks, and months that followed the departure of the Women's Auxiliary from under the auspices of the EPPIA. And as if to add insult to injury, the Women's Club decided to partner with a local businessmen's association in handling some or instigating some of the projects that were of mutual interest, and those were town beautification, fence building. Oftentimes the cattle in the town kind of roamed around, and that made the visitors nervous. So there was a movement to create fencing, and also to protect the deer population from hunters. The The ladies also purchased a sprinkler, which they used on Elkhorn Avenue to keep the dust down, and as one of their initial projects. But the first major project was the creation of a trail. Whoops, I've got out of order here, I think. Let's see what I got. No, there it is. It was a trail between the town and the summit of Deer Mountain, which Eleanor, who was a gifted horsewoman, helped to lay out. And so originally it was known as the Deer Mountain Hondius Trail, or vice versa. About the same time, the Women's Club decided to join the state and federal, the state and federation, the state federation and the National Federation of Women's Clubs, and they then turned their attention to the library. The first effort was opening a reading room. It was actually a central mission of the Women's Club, and it involved both Eleanor and Alma. The first step they took was to rent a room at the Hupp Hotel, which was located at the intersection of Elkhorn and Moraine. It's still there. Of course, it's now the Indian Village souvenir shop. Perhaps they chose that site for the reading room because Cornelius Bond had bought the building the previous year, but more likely it was because Josie Hupp, who was the proprietress of the Hupp Hotel, was a member of the Women's Club. Another club member, Adele Ramsey, made signs for announcing the library room put in the large windows in the hotel. The club paid to have that room heated, and they began busily putting up shelves and stocking them with books donated from local residents. Now, a boon to this effort was the arrival of books from the Colorado Traveling Library Commission. This organization had been founded in 1898 by Women's Club of Denver. And by 1903, which was well before this, that organization had been taken over by the state. So the state was now funding this traveling library. By the time Estes Park got involved, the commission offered 266 sets of 50 volumes each. These were organized in categories, as librarians do. There were juvenile books, general interest books, reference books. There were also magazines and leaflets. Each case carried a number or a name, and usually the name of the donor. And these were, in the words of the Denver Club women, to be living monuments that build character and continue to bring light and sunshine into the lives of those into whose hands these books fall. The books were shipped in these wooden cases, which were designed when open to display the books. So it was a pretty neat and efficient way to do this. And the books themselves were books that were donated to and collected by the Denver women of the Women's Club there. Our Women's Club made selection decisions, arranged for shipping and returning the books, and they took turns running this little reading room. Got myself mixed up here. While the reading room was initially popular, after a while, its popularity declined. And so the women turned to the prospect of carrying out their original plan, which was to have its own library. They also wanted to have a meeting room in the library for their own meetings. So in in October 1914, the Women's Club met at Fall River Lodge and created a library committee comprised of Alma Bond and the usual suspects. Louise Hayden was on that committee, and Dorothy Schwartz, Mrs. McMahon with her hand on her hip, you may recall, and Mrs. Grace, who I don't have a picture of. Her husband owned the Gracecraft, which was a little shop downtown at the time. They also determined to set up a library building fund, and they gave that $500 to that, which they then were loaned out so that it would earn some interest. To ensure that the library would not just founder after it got started, the idea was that the Women's Club would continue to fund this. And they decided to do this by using 1/3 of the yearly dues that were raised in Women's Club to fund this, the ongoing activities. Well, they got sidetracked for a bit. Scarcely 2 months later, the library moved out of the Hupp Hotel and into the Estes Park Public School. Now, accounts differ as to whose idea this was. Harriet Burgess's account says that the Women's Club approached the school board and asked them for a room in exchange for the fact that they would take over the school library in exchange. There was another version asserted that this was the school board's idea to relocate the library. But given the fact that Louise Hayden had just been elected to the school board, that seems also quite possible. In any case, combining the school library and public libraries was a very common solution in many towns in the country during this period of time. The resources were limited, expertise was limited, and it often made good sense to run 2 libraries out of one establishment. The new library opened its doors in the school in December. It didn't take the ladies long to move, you'll notice. There were 262 donated books on the shelves, and they also had a new set of encyclopedia that Clem Ure, who was a local innkeeper and poet and songwriter, musician, had donated. And the faculty of the school had suggested magazine subscriptions, so those were to be carried there too. The cost to the public of using the library in the school was 5 cents per volume. It was open to the public 2 afternoons a week, Tuesdays and Fridays from 2 to 5. Now, the first year, Alma's daughter, Florence, remember, one of the little twins, served as the librarian. She was paid $1.50 a week. She would just have been about 17 years old at the time, and probably just graduated from high school and was looking for something to do. She only had the job for that year because by 1918, her mother had taken over and was using a little committee of volunteers to help her. We don't know why Florence gave up the job, but eventually she had a permanent job at the post office, so perhaps that was the reason. Inevitably, the school population grew as the town grew, and the school board eventually asked for the room back, at which point the hunt was on now for a new permanent site for the library. Originally, the club had bought 2 lots on Davis Hill, thinking that they would build their library there, but one of those lots had been given to the government for the headquarters of Rocky Mountain National Park, so that was not going to be available. Instead, they also thought the library should have a more central location, and so what they had their eye on was this little triangular piece of land that was in the center of town, near the school and near the post office. The town gave them that land for the library, and the town also purchased that other lot that the women owned on Davis Hill. So there's an interesting interactions between the town and the library almost always, but it's one reason why the Women's Club is able to use space in town hall for a while, etc. And the club women raised all the money that was needed for this library. It cost $5,000, and that included the furnishings. The town left the design of the building, the furnishing of the building, and the construction of the building, all those details to the Women's Club. And they decided that they would have moss rock foundation, large fireplaces, exposed beams, all of these architectural elements they felt would reflect the rusticity of their surroundings. It won't come as a surprise that Eleanor Hondius was charged with or chaired the building committee. The library was completed in 1922, and the townspeople literally built it. The club women recruited volunteers, and these included the mayor, the people on the town council, etc. At the end of the summer, they had a celebratory picnic, and here are some of the library workers who apparently were out hunting rocks. If you can see the lower right, Eleanor Hondius is sitting, and she has her hands clasped over her knees. Her husband Peter is more central. He has a pipe in his mouth, and he's leaning against a rock. And little Peter, their son, is standing next to his father in his sailor suit. I should throw in something at this point, because I don't really talk about Peter Jr., except to say that he and his late wife, Helen, were picked up where Eleanor left off in terms of their commitment to the town library, to the town museum. They were benefactors in so many ways. And so her legacy really lives on in Peter. Well, at the time that the museum opened, the library opened, it had about 1,500 volumes. The annual fee was $1. Children, however, were not charged anything. They were just given library cards. And when it opened, Alma Bond had been installed as the permanent librarian. She continued as librarian until 1939, so 25-year stint. And when she retired, she had broken her hip in 1937, and then she and Ora Carr, who had been a past president of the Women's Club, kind of shared the duty for about a year, and then Ora Carr took over and became a librarian for another 25 years. But it's important to give Alma credit for pioneering, in a way, what we now consider to be more contemporary librarianship, if you will. She was not just a keeper of books. She had instituted programs, and the notion of library service was something that she brought into being. There were all kinds of literature programming, etc. So beyond the merely clerical, which so many small town librarians fell into, she really advanced a model that is in use today in the libraries of today. One thing that she also did, which was kind of pioneering, was that she provided the club detailed monthly report of all the library activities, the books that were donated, the circulation statistics, any events that they had had. And these were also published in the newspaper. So that she was a pioneer also in making the library part of the community and part of the community's knowledge of itself, if you will. Now, through the years, Women's Club continued to fund the library. In fact, it became a budget item in 1925, and it was so up until the time that the town took over the responsibility for the library, which was in 1968. During the Depression years, going back a little bit, the library initiated an outreach program. This was another innovation. They opened a branch library in Nunn, Colorado, using 200 duplicate books that they had on the shelves, and as the little nest egg for this branch library. The fact that the Nunn library's new librarian was the sister of the Estes Park Women's Club's president at that particular time may have had something to do with this venture. However, the library also had a small it organized a small traveling library for the tiny Larimer County villages, and they operated that for many years. In 1935, the library building was greatly expanded by who else? Eleanor Hondius, who donated a new reading room as a memorial to her husband who had passed away the previous year. At that same time, Women's Club installed a new bathroom and a new coal stove. In her club history, Harriet Burgess notes that it was Alma's responsibility to tote the coal in for the stove and to tote the coal ashes out. I'm not sure how that fit into her day, but at any rate, that was also her responsibility. Thanks to the constancy of Women's Club's commitment to the town, the Estes Valley Library is flourishing, and it remains a very vibrant presence in our community. Over time, of course, the Women's Club has been leader in many other local projects and philanthropies. In addition to the library, most notably, they championed the creation of Rocky Mountain National Park and the National Park movement, which Ken Burns has described as America's best idea. They have been faithful in their support for public education. They continue to provide financial and volunteer support for the public schools. They also were interested in social reforms related to the abolition of the death penalty, the end of child labor, improvement conditions and issues for Native Americans. And of course, during the Second World War, they were very active in collecting scrap metal locally and paper. And they even helped with the purchase of a bomber for the war effort. For these and other contributions, in 2012, the town celebrated the club's first 100 years with a proclamation on which they recognized the club as the longest continuing force for community betterment in Estes Park. I think Alma and Eleanor and the other charter members of Women's Club would be very pleased. A good historian always provides her sources. And so I want to thank the Estes Park Museum for their photos. I also made reference and or found a lot of information that I used in Jim Pickering's book, This Blue Hollow in America's Switzerland. Harriet Burgess's Then the Woman Took Over, and of course, the memoirs of Eleanor E. Hondius of Elkhorn Lodge. The Estes Park Trail is now available, digitized, which is wonderful. And I use those as well as resources of the Family Search organization, which is run by the Mormon Church, and Ancestry.com. And so if you have some questions, I'll try to answer them. If I don't have, I can always make up what I don't know. And so I will.
Diane, would you like to go first?
Okay. I was trying to, Nancy, I was trying to make a connection between the Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek. Did you read that?
I have not, and I need to read it. And I know a little bit about those librarians who did that, but I have not read that book. I understand it's great.
I was just thinking, I read the book a while ago. So Cheryl, I don't know the dates of Eleanor Roosevelt and when the Bookwomen rode the mules and the pack horse, the packs on their mules and panniers. So I guess that those women on the Bookwomen of Troublesome, this Bookwoman and all these women that rode and gave books to folks in the mountains, in the backwoods, was a precursor to this traveling library that was used when books came up from Denver, I guess, and they were
Well, I think that these are two parallel kinds of operations. I think the Bookwomen, you mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt, that would be the Depression years. And so by the Depression years, our library here had, it was still using donated books, mind you. I'm not sure when the budgets were created that allowed books to be purchased, but certainly during the 20s and the Depression years, they were still accepting donations as help to build a collection here in town. But in rural areas in Appalachia is what I'm thinking, and in the rural South, where there were no library resources, then what there is a precursor is to the bookmobiles that still do serve rural areas in this country. So I think that that's more the connection rather than the libraries that were shipped, back and forth.
It was still a great idea to get books in the hands of people that normally wouldn't have the access.
Absolutely. And I think that's that devotion to the betterment and education of the community certainly drove all of these initiatives that were made in all permutations of librarianship, if you will.
Yes, that was definitely our thought by asking for this history, was to just show the parallelisms between two communities that were trying to get books in the hands of their citizens.
I think what was also underscored here, the role of women, the importance of women. These are women who do this outreach. For the most part, although in the early days, maybe not so much, there were certainly men, the province of male librarians tended to be academic libraries and public libraries, and school libraries are more the province of women. But I do think that's not it's not a coincidence. I think very much that it was, it's what women do. It's one of the things that we do best, I think, is we care for the whole person, including the brain, if you will.
I have a question about where the first school and library was located in the town.
It was that little school was, I believe it was where the bank building is now. Because that was also the site of the first high, or it was near it was the site of the first high school.
Mhm.
Anyway, too. So, but that's where it was. And one reason, and then, and it was one reason why the women's club thought that was such a good idea to be down there, was it would be closer. And I don't know, and I'm not sure, I don't know that Harriet mentions any cooperation between the town and the high school after after they split, so to speak. And the library went off, the public library built its own building. I don't, but certainly there probably was coordination or joint efforts, I would think.
I am curious, those women in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s that belonged to the women's club, were a lot of them working mothers?
Well, I mean, I always think all mothers are working mothers.
Okay.
But
Working
whether they were
outside the
paid,
home.
but what you mean with the gainful employ.
Or just working outside the home.
Right, exactly. That I don't know. I can't tell you, but certainly a good percentage, I feel, were just by virtue of Estes Park. It just seems to me that were a lot of people who lived here full time were had ties to businesses. And so I have a feeling that many of them did help in that regard.
And Alma, as the mother of 5 kids at home, certainly fits the bill as
Oh my gosh, can you imagine? And I thought she looked pretty good in that picture. I had to keep using that picture because it's the only picture that I could find of her. But I'm not through looking, that's the trouble. Historians and librarians are tenacious researchers. And so I will not let that go. I still think that somewhere out there, maybe I'm looking in the wrong direction too. I don't know. As far as I know, Florence stayed here her whole life, but Frank, the twins, Frank and Florence, Frank ended up in Connecticut. And I believe he was an electrical engineer. I'm not positive of that, but at any rate, had his daughter ended up as an editor for Harper's. So, these really, really sharp people. And so maybe if I go to Connecticut resources, I can track Frank, and maybe that's the answer. Maybe somewhere there would be some information on her, but it's not easy. And I mean, it's not his story for nothing. It was the men's lives that were documented. It was the men's activities that were charted. It's only been, I would say, in the last 50 years or so that people have evinced an interest in the story of how people actually lived. And you know, I've seen that over the course of my own career, that those stories, which I find to be the most compelling, were stories that were ignored for so many years. Because history became political history. And I think that's being reclaimed now. Certainly so many more stories now that are being written people want to know how life was lived, mudsill level, if you will. And I do think that's changed, but it makes it difficult to find women's stories.
And certainly the Women's Club initiative to have people write these wonderful paragraphs about the women of Estes Park is such a wonderful effort.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's been a delightful series, and I'm so glad. There's going to be the statue of Eleanor Handy is going to be installed downtown. I guess they're at the corner of Riverside and Elkhorn, maybe.
Not far from the park, right?
Yeah, right. It would be across from where Bond Park, then the next block over. So I think that's wonderful. It's great to see Eleanor particularly, get her due.
I want to just thank Nancy for this wonderful presentation, for taking us back in time and helping us remember some of the important history about the women of Estes Park. You made me, Nancy, want to get out my old black Centennial hat during the Women's Club. And we always say Woman's Club because that was the way it was founded.
Exactly. Exactly.
So anyway, this was delightful. Thanks.
Well,
Thank you.
you're very welcome. It was fun. It was fun to do. As I say, many of you have heard these stories before, so you were gracious to listen again.
But they were new to others of us like me. So thank you very much.
Well, that's good. I'm glad of that. Well, we had, I myself have, would like to find out more about some of these early women, beyond, beyond Eleanor. I would like, the Hayden family was very instrumental in creating Estes Park. I made many contributions. It was a large family, and they had lots of powerful women in that family. I'd like to find out more about them. And of course, they're and the interrelations. The early settlers, the daughters married the sons or whatever. So there were a lot of interlocking family relationships in Estes Park, which I also think is kind of fun to know about.
Mhm.
So there's just a whole lot to do. Just when to find the time, when I have all my own photographs that are unsorted still.
Let's see, I unmuted myself.